Good evening, everyone. Hi. It's really good to be here, actually. I've worked with Kate for, she's gone, worked with Kate for about kind of 8 years. We've done loads of presentations together. I talk about the school all the time, but I've never actually been here, so it's really good to get a chance to come here this evening. Thanks for turning up such late notice. We decided to put this on just before Easter, so yeah, thanks for taking the time to come out today. And we're going to talk a little bit about this work that we've been doing at the Education Endowment Foundation around implementation and this guidance that we've created around what the evidence says about how you implement and manage change. What have I done? I've broken it. So just about briefly about the EEF. Have everyone heard of the Education Endowment Foundation? Familiar with what we do? So, I mean, broadly speaking, you can break out what we do around generating evidence. So we run lots of evaluations, lots of randomized trials, synthesizing evidence, so aggregating findings into kind of summaries. Probably might have heard of a resource called the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which is an aggregation of evidence relating to lots of different teaching strategies and activities. And then the final bit, which is my particular interest, is around how do you mobilize that evidence, how do you bring it to life and get it applied in schools at scale. And we started off doing a lot of the generation evidence, and we still do that, but we're more thinking about how your evidence gets applied. And I guess one of the things that I guess motivated this work on implementation is that we found a lot about what works from running these trials, but we've also found a lot, and probably as much, around how things work, and the processes and the kind of types of professional development that lead to things working, as well as the actual kind of interventions in themselves. And that's led us to thinking more explicitly around implementation. So I guess this diagram really kind of captures one of the challenges that we face as an organisation around implementation, which is that it's difficult to do things at scale with rigour without throwing huge amounts of money at it. And I would even say that even if you do have lots of money, it's still really, really difficult to do things kind of at scale and with rigour. So we can do a trial and do an evaluation of something across 20 schools or 30 schools, start to see an effect. But then when you try and take that to 50 schools or 100 schools, it's hard to replicate that. And often that's a challenge around implementing it as you've intended and have you evaluated it at kind of smaller scale. But this challenge also plays out in a school, doesn't it? Or across a department where there'll be pockets of something working well, but trying to get that working consistently at scale across a school or across a kind of group of schools becomes difficult. So I guess this is one of the things that we're trying to work out. How do you do things well at scale? It's not just education that faces this challenge. Almost all fields you see, kind of, if you want to call them implementation gaps between what's known and what the evidence suggests and its actual kind of use in practice. So an example of this is kind of hand washing in hospitals, which it wasn't too long ago where this was quite a significant cause of death, with people going in, getting secondary infections through poor hand washing practices in hospitals, and kind of other practices, picking up infections and leading to further kind of complications. And it's an area where they've made I actually saw a note, you've got things in the toilet, haven't you, that talk about hand washing processes. And it's an area where they've made a lot of difference. The other thing to say is that what's interesting with this is you speak to surgical teams and they knew the evidence. So it wasn't a kind of knowledge thing. People knew how to wash hands, but it wasn't manifesting itself in the practices in a day-to-day way. And what they've done is they've focused really heavily on the implementation of that knowledge. So if you're going to hospitals now, you can't move kind of dispensers, can you, of foam dispensers. If you've had an operation, a local anaesthetic operation, you'll hear the surgical teams have to say that they've been through a hand washing protocol. So they've kind of operationalised the evidence and the knowledge around hand washing, and that's led to real significant changes in the number of complications and death as a result of that. That led us, this kind of gap, this implementation gap, led us thinking, well, what does the evidence say around implementation? And can we pull that together into something that people can use? So around about a year ago, we published this, what we called Putting Evidence to Work, A School's Guide to Implementation. I wrote this with my colleague Stephen Fraser and a woman called Bianca Albers. And we looked at the evidence around implementation in education, looked across other fields, and tried to produce a kind of more accessible set of guidance in relation to that. Are people aware of this? Have they seen? No? A couple of people. And actually, this has been taken up quite well, and I think it starts to unpack some of the processes around effective implementation. I've learned a lot in kind of putting this together, and I won't go through all of these, but one of the things that, just to kind of start at the top here, one of the things that consistently comes up when you talk about implementation is that it's not rocket science, but it's the aggregation of lots of small things done well. So, most of the things that we'll talk about and run through here are kind of common sense, if you like, and the things that I think you'll be familiar with. But it's actually surprisingly uncommon to aggregate those together into an overall thoughtful kind of evidence-based process. And one of the consequences of that is actually, good implementation is relatively rare, and what you have is a kind of mismatch or dilution of the vision that you have for what you're trying to do and its manifestation in terms of kind of the practices in the school. So we're not short of vision statements in the education system, are we? But as you go round an organisation, you see less shared vision in relation to that central vision, and then you see less shared practice in relation to that shared vision. So one way of thinking about what we're talking about here is narrowing the kind of gap between that point and that shared practice. You're trying to kind of narrow those two things together. What are the things on here? I think you can think about this guide, and we've seen it being used to implement lots of different things, programs, kind of externally developed programs, things developed internally within the school. You can use it to think about changes to practices. You can use it. We've seen it people to use it to change structures within the school, ways of reducing attendance. So I think it's quite flexible. You can also do a good job of implementing something completely inappropriate. You could implement Brain Gym really well. I wouldn't suggest that, but this is about kind of the process of making the changes. This is one of Kevin's, my boss's, things. When he was talking about this, he said the problem, Jonathan, with implementation, he said it's just not sexy. And I don't think he was. Yeah, well, yeah, maybe we'll come back to the gardening bit. But he said, it's just not sexy. And I don't think he really meant implementation wasn't sexy, but what he was referring to, I think, was that it's more exciting to go to the BET conference and see, the whiz-bang use of, Iris Connect or iPads or virtual, the more kind of exciting aspects of innovation in education. We get drawn to those, but actually the reality of picking a priority over a kind of, 2 or 3 year thing, rolling up your sleeves, thinking about careful, thoughtful implementation and sustaining, it's just, it's not as exciting. But, it should be, because the bottom line is that for me, all roads end at this point, and it doesn't matter how good your idea or intervention or plan is on paper. The only thing that matters is how it manifests itself in our behaviours day to day. So I like this phrase, the practitioner is the intervention. Like, the intervention is just a kind of thing over there, an idea or a thought or a plan. The only thing that matters is how that is appearing in our behaviours and actions over here. So all this evidence-informed improvement stuff ultimately dies if we're not translating the kind of the ideas and the interventions into practice. Since we launched this, there's been a kind of a useful, interesting alignment with aspects of Ofsted's kind of conversations. So that if you've seen the draft around the new inspection framework, they're talking helpfully, quite explicitly around processes relating to intention, implementation, and impact. Again, to be really commended, they produced an evidence review alongside the new framework. It's worth a look. And in that review, they're explicitly talking about the importance of implementation as a structured process where leaders plan, resource, and monitor and embed changes in a kind of thoughtful way. And although this guide, this reference, by the way, is the guide, so they're referencing explicitly this piece of work here. And although it does relate to implement, it also, as you'll hear, also relates to intention as well. So what we're trying to capture here is not just the consequence of the decision, but making a really careful, appropriate decisions in the first place as well. Okay, so that just a kind of introduction. How about this, just kind of as a little exercise? See, this is a cathartic thing. So think of a project that you've been involved in that, despite the best intentions, kind of lost momentum and faded away. And I could run through loads. I know things that I've been involved in that they never met the expectation that we had of them, and often just down to how they were implemented. They just didn't kind of land as expected. And then try and think through something that, along those lines, but also try and think where it might have kind of fallen down. Was it something that in the planning of it? Wasn't it just kind of, was it just the plan wasn't clearly communicated, people didn't understand it before you rolled it out? Was it something in delivery? Did you actually start it, but down to all sorts of reasons, it kind of just didn't get traction? People didn't kind of get moving. It didn't kind of get, it never quite got going. Or was it something around sustainability? Did it get moving, but some key individual left the school, something changed so that it got up to speed, but it never was sustained for a number of reasons. So just spend a couple of minutes, chat to the person next to you or in your tables, and just kind of think through something that went wrong. Yeah. Okay, so that just a kind of introduction. So like all our guidance reports that we kind of create, we like trying to get lots of content onto one slide, and these are this is a kind of summary of recommendations from this guidance report. By the way, we can share these slides. You're very welcome to the slides, and also we can share guidance report. I should have brought some along actually, but we can share those with people. So you can't read the kind of the detail here. There are about 25 kind of individual recommendations, but just to point out at this stage, there are kind of two bits to this piece of guidance. The first bit, or the bulk of it, talks about these different phases of implementation: explore, prepare, deliver, and sustain. And often the research and when you're thinking about a process kind of drops into these four phases. But the bit kind of that are above the top is that there are things that act as cross-cutting themes that underpin as kind of foundations the activities that sit across those four phases. So we've been calling these foundations for kind of good implementation, and they set the basis by which then the more sequential kind of steps fit onto. That's the kind of overview. This diagram perhaps is the thing that I think people have been able to get their head around probably the most, which is taking those recommendations and just summarise them further, and it quite nicely shows this process a bit kind of clearer. So at the top there, you can imagine a kind of process begins. This first phase, explore, is about really sharply defining the priority that you have, thinking very systematically about options and ideas of things you can implement. As you said there, then taking very seriously the step of examining the fit and feasibility. It might be in principle the effective thing. Is it going to work for us here? There's then a decision that you might make, or a number of decisions that you might make. This phase then is all about preparation, so having a kind of clear plan. Really then thinking, well, now we've got a really clear plan. Are we in a position to be able to do that? Practically preparing, so training staff, getting resources ready, getting kind of lining everything up. No, nothing's happened yet in terms of delivery. But then at this point now, you're going to start, right, we're going to give this a go, we're going to start introducing it. And then this phase here, which we've been calling deliver, is all about, rapid, continuous kind of improvement. So it's about solving problems, identifying solutions within your organisation to solve those problems, backing up initial training with follow-on support, monitoring implementation so you can learn how it's all kind of going. And then if then it's getting traction, you then think about, well, how do we kind of get more stable use of that by sustaining it, by nurturing it, and then hopefully you might think about scaling it up. So it kind of capturing an overall process. Oh, I'll show you. I don't know if it's obvious, but there's these kind of icons in the middle. Is it clear that they're about gardening? Vaguely. So when we were putting this together, it's quite an abstract topic, implementation, and it's quite hard to kind of pin down what it means. So we were trying to think of a metaphor, and I can't remember exactly where it came from, but we stumbled on this idea of gardening and thinking about how these phases related to that. And this isn't my garden, but it might as well be my garden. And when we were thinking about implementation, I realised that I do gardening a little bit like we tend to do implementation in education, which is a kind of series of random sporadic events, rather than a kind of thoughtful, planned out process that's delivered. So normally, it's right about this time of year that I do gardening, which is like a kind of annual event where the first sort of really nice weekend of the year, I rush out to the garden, really have a cursory glance. I don't think about what happened last year. I don't really plan it out. I don't think about what's the right thing to do. You just pack the family into the car, drive to the garden centre, and just spend a fortune on the most inappropriate plants. Like kind of plants with like bushy leaves that the slugs eat the minute you put them in, or plants that die the minute it gets beneath sort of 10 degrees. And then bring them home, just dig some holes, put them in, and water them, and you maybe get a burst of colour, but by August we're back to this again, right? And the analogy, of course, that I'm kind of labouring is that I'm not treating gardening. So I've heard the key to gardening is not sort of grand gestures of running off and doing things. It's about the careful, ongoing, accumulation of small things over the kind of course of the year. And just doing the right thing at the right time and kind of carefully nurturing it. And I think that's really, really relevant for implementation. The other thing that I think is particularly relevant for gardening is that it's all about what you do before you put the plants in the soil, so I've been told. And that, if you select the right plants, get rid of the weeds, get rid of the slugs, kind of clear the ground, get it fertilised, do all that. If you do all of that work, and you've got the right plant in the right place, actually putting it in, and then from there, as long as it's reasonably straightforward, right? So, sure, it's vulnerable. You've got to nurture it, tend to it, kind of watch and grow. But the investment of time and effort before you start delivery, really, or planting, really pays dividends in the long-term health of the plant, and that is a really relevant point for thinking about implementation. Which kind of relates to the first recommendation. The other thing that's relevant, I think, there is a risk, I think, with this process that it presents implementation as far too a kind of neat, logical, step 1, step 2, step 3, and of course we've got to try and represent it in a way that you can engage. But I would encourage you, if you're going to look at this, to see it a bit looser than that, and see it as a more overall idea framework for things that you might consider to doing as part of a process, rather than a kind of really rigid, kind of sequential, kind of process. Because implementation doesn't go like that, does it? The real world, messy things happen. It snows in March after you've planted your seedlings. It's not a like gardening. We're operating in a real messy world where things are outside of your control. And the other thing I would say is that don't let the best be the enemy of the good on this. You might not be able to do kind of all of it, but this is essentially is a theoretical kind of framework rather than, it's not always feasible to do all of this every time. Okay, so the first recommendation in this report kind of captures what we were just talking about, which is treat implementation as a process, not an event. Going to your point about time, you need time, of course, to be able to do this. And I would say particularly around in the preparation, the stuff you do before delivery. And the only way you can do this is ultimately by prioritising, and we can't prioritise everything. It's not a priority then. So, this leads you to a point where I think we have to start thinking about probably perhaps doing a fewer things better rather than trying to do lots of things, trying to do lots of things at the same kind of time. And to do that, we've got to be quite bold and think about, well, what isn't working? If we can't just keep adding more and more, we can't keep planting more and more plants in the border. What are we going to have to get rid of to create the space for that new thing to grow? And one of the characteristics I've seen across all the research school networks is they're very clear about what not to do. They have a not to do list. Either things that they've tried and have evaluated and shown isn't going to work for them, or things where there's evidence to suggest it probably isn't worth looking at in the first place. And all of them that I've seen are very clear about what not to do, as well as things that they're going to take on. So we have to, I think, we have to be careful before we start implementing more things. I think one of the first questions is what things can we perhaps stop doing to create the space for this, and then that leads you into a conversation around, well, de-implementation, because in principle it should be easy to stop, but it's not, is it? It's like stopping smoking, stopping these. We have behaviours that are kind of woven into the life of a school, where things get kind of embedded in there, and it's not as easy as saying stop doing them. And I think really where this is a kind of new field that's emerging, and where I think it leads you need to treat stopping something as seriously as starting something, and think carefully about what a plan would look like to de-implement something as well as start something kind of new. Okay, so that's the first recommendation. The second thing then talks more about the culture and climate. I think you talked about the kind of foundation. So what's the kind of culture and climate in which implementation seems to thrive? And yeah, the research here kind of looks at the things, the factors, the kind of cultures that influence whether or not things get take hold within a school. And as you'd probably expect, it's when there's a culture of enthusiasm, when there's a culture of trust, when people feel as though they are part of the changes, not just the recipient of the changes. That idea of kind of self-efficacy. The implementation seems to go better. And it's another one of Kevin's phrases, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It doesn't matter how good your plans are, but if you've not got that kind of foundations in place in terms of culture, then this is going to be difficult to implement change. There's also some sections of the report that talk about the leadership of implementation. And just kind of very briefly, my take-home kind of interpretation of that was that implementation seems to work best when you have dedicated but distributed leadership. So by that, dedicated leadership, setting the vision, clear articulation of what we're doing, why we're doing it, but then the ownership of the changes is carried broader than just the leadership team or the kind of head, and the actual the leadership of the implementation has representatives across the school in terms of rolling that kind of out. And one way you can do that, again, which is some evidence related to, is having a kind of implementation team that take responsibility for overseeing a particular change. So I don't forget. How long have we got? So this is a video. I'll put this on. This is a video of a school in Sheffield. It's called Pie Bank School. We've done a lot of work around teaching assistant deployment. We were just talking about it before. And this is the head, Maureen Andrews, who's talking about how they created she has a particular phrase for it, but it's an implementation team who took responsibility for planning, overseeing and monitoring the changes in TA deployment at the school.
Is practice in the classroom better as a result of the work we're doing, and why do you think that is?
Maureen Andrews is head teacher of Piebank CE Primary School in Sheffield. She created a TA development team containing TAs from across the school to help drive the implementation of the report's recommendations. What were the first steps that you took as head teacher to facilitate that change?
Well, at the time when I began to look into this, I'd been at the school for probably about 6 months, and I could see we had some very skilled people in school. And I had a real, from discussions with someone who's an Ofsted inspector in schools, really clarified my thinking around if we were going to bring about change, we had to look at the deployment of teaching assistants and then the skills that those teaching assistants have and marry that up. So we were taking care of both. So we very quickly formed a development team. Again, deliberate choice of language rather than a change team. We called it a development team. And that development team involves teaching assistants, HLTAs, a teacher, and then some senior leaders. And they're the team who then, having heard my vision for what we wanted in school, we then created more of a shared vision for that. And that was about, actually, if we're doing it at our best, what will it look like? What are the possibilities? Because again, it's a lot of, well, we've always worked in a certain way with teaching assistants. So let's awaken the possibilities that actually we can look at this differently. And that allowed us to really draw together that living vision.
When you started to make changes in school, what conclusions did you draw about deployment, and how did you then start to change deployment as a result?
People had perhaps begun to work in a tried and tested way, that then they weren't looking at some of the other opportunities. So we realised we had to share more practice very quickly to begin to really look at the strengths that people had across school in terms of questioning, supporting that independence, and looking at then some of the barriers to really great deployment are those things such as the time and being able to get together. So we realised we had to find those ways to communicate really well.
You know, in that work on TA deployment, it really benefits from having a broad range of representations on it. I mean, the whole nature of TA deployment is it kind of cuts across the school, it's leadership, it relates to teaching roles, TA roles, and you know, we found time and time again with that work is that if there's a kind of small group that plan it out, that test the feasibility, that trial things, that oversee it, then it really seems to pay kind of dividends. But I think, you know, I think you can apply that to lots of different changes. Okay, so so actually in the report there are sets of checklists at the end of each question, at the end of each section. We just aggregated these into a kind of master checklist. So we've got a whole set of new resources coming out in the next month or two, and that's one of them. So there's kind of, at the end of each section, there are things that you can reflect on in relation to practice within the school. Just turn that down. Okay. So that's the foundations. Then you're into these kind of phases of implementation. We'll move through these kind of pretty quick. So the first phase is really around making the right decisions in terms of what you implement. The first step of that is making sure that you've got a really tight area for improvement in the first place, and you've characterised the issue and the thing you want to work out with enough kind of detail. And I think the take-home message we say here is be specific. You know, try and get beyond just characterising something around, you know, an issue around literacy, which dimensions of literacy, which kind of particular. Try and get into the detail. I think that would be what we try and encourage. Draw on a range of sources, pupil information, staffing, speak to people, try and get a rich picture of what's going on, obviously data of various different sorts. And we all fall into this trap of sometimes starting with a solution and looking for a problem. You know, I was a governor of a school that wanted desperate to buy iPads. I was like, why do you want iPads? And they wanted the iPads, but they weren't quite clear what problem and what they were trying to do with that. And classic IT trap that, you know, you get bamboozled by the technology without thinking really what you want to do with it. So try and think of it the other way around. Once you've done that, you can then think, well, what a range of different approaches that might be suitable to look at. Obviously at the EEF, there are a range of things around guidance reports, toolkits, promising projects that you can look at. But of course, it might be, your own experience of things that you found effective that you supplement into that evidence base. But this, and that's kind of quite typical of school improvement. But this step we sometimes overlook, which is really then thinking, okay, it might have worked somewhere else, but is it going to work for us? I won't kind of go through these, but there's lots of questions that you can ask yourself around, does it really address the defined challenge in the school? Does it align with our kind of values? Does it fit with how we see ourselves as an organisation? Do we have the motivation? Are we in a place to start this, etc., etc.? What can we stop, to make the space of time of that? And again, I'd encourage, before you dive into making a decision, to really try and take that a bit of time to just think about, is it going to work for us? Okay, that's kind of explored. Then let's say that on the back of that you've decided to pick a particular pathway or an approach. This is the biggest bit of the section of this report, and it breaks down into kind of three sections. And the first is having a really clear, well-specified plan that sets out a number of things. Firstly, why are we doing this? So trying to articulate what's the issue that we're trying to address. What actually is the intervention? So trying to pin down you get beyond the name of it, what are the actual, we use this phrase, active ingredients, the kind of core components. When you distill it, what are we talking about? What is the actual intervention? How is it going to be implemented? So that's why. How is it going to be implemented? What activities are going to deliver it? How are we going to know it's working? So how are we going to see this emerging in our behaviours across the school? And then who's going to be affected? Who are we doing this? And I guess ultimately, so what? What's the point? What we're looking to? So broadly speaking, a plan that should, in however you do it, set out why we're doing it, what it is, how we're going to get there, how we're going to know it's happening, who's involved, and what we're looking to achieve. This is a template that people have been using to try and structure that. And this is an example of an implementation plan for a project called Flash Marking that we're doing a trial of. That's around reducing teacher workloads by reducing written feedback in books. They use a code-based system, and they've kind of distilled this implementation down to this kind of plan. And we've got lots of these examples of these implementation plans and logic models kind of emerging that you can access from our website. There's one key bit here. So I think we're quite used to specifying the problem. This bit around what we're calling the active ingredients, I think, has been the thing that, if anything needs a bit of unpacking, it's perhaps this. So by the active ingredients, what we're referring to are, what are the real essential kind of principles and practices for your approach, for your intervention, that need to be adopted to get the impacts. Or perhaps a more kind of simple or accessible way to see that. If you think about in a couple of years' time, what are going to be the core consistent activities and behaviours that are going to capture that kind of working well? So you might be doing something around formative assessment. That might look different in different kind of subjects and contexts. But what are going to be the key consistent activities and behaviours that you're looking for across the organisation? And what we found is that one of the kind of challenges of implementation is that we often head into a change without really having a clear understanding of what the actual intervention is. And if you get this right, it really underpins the approach. If you can really distill down what the actual kind of core components are, then you can use it to really support the rest of the implementation process. Just to kind of give you an example of this, I kind of stumbled across this last year, which was an article, I think it was in the newspaper, I saw it, and it was something that the England football, kind of the whole England setup have been doing, trying to kind of distill down for them what their core kind of principles and behaviours they were looking to do. So some of these relate to activities on the pitch. One of the principles that they were trying to get happening across all the teams, the junior teams, the senior teams, women's teams, men's teams, was getting the players to look up and play forward. They wanted them to hold the ball, but they wanted them to be proactive that. So they've captured that in terms of a kind of core consistent behaviour that they're looking to achieve.
We wanted to put down on paper what we stand for, what do we believe in, how do we want our players to look, how do we want to play, how do we want to coach, how do we want to look after our players before competition, during competition, after competition, how do we want to travel. So one of the mantras that we have is the only thing that changes is the size of the shirt. So as they come through that player pathway from an under 15 boy or girl all the way through to the seniors, we've got some consistent messages around it.
I think everybody at every level of the game is looking for leadership from the FA to say, this is what we believe. You're part of the process of developing future England winning teams, because everybody that touches a player along the pathway would have played a part from grassroots, from their first experiences of football through club academies into the national team. There's consistency of messages, and a lot of that will come back to needing the player to have a growth mindset and wanting to continually learn and improve.
The purpose is to define England teams and England players for the future. We have to have a seamless structure where there's a golden thread that runs through all of the teams, that we're coaching them consistently. The messages are the same. We're playing the same way. We're selecting talent in the same way to play that, to play the England way. So we have to ensure we get those core elements right. If we don't, what tends to happen is players will progress through the age groups and the messages will be confused.
Something that we tried to do at one of my former clubs is to try and do something really similar, try and join up some of our practice from first team down to the junior teams, the 8 and 9-year-olds in the academy, as well as scouting, as well as performance services. And I just feel that if everybody's on the same page and everybody buys into and believes what you're trying to do, it becomes so much more powerful.
The one thing it won't be is a paper document, because as soon as you put words on paper that are out of date, it's emerging and evolving and it'll grow.
It's the emerging DNA. I don't think it's ever finished. I think we're always looking to improve. I don't think anybody's claiming we've got the answers and we're absolutely sure everything is right. We'll keep tweaking it, we'll keep changing it, we'll keep listening to opinions and we'll keep improving it.
It kind of captures it quite nicely, doesn't it? That idea of trying to kind of distill out the kind of kernel of what you're talking about. Just to give you an education example, if I was thinking about implementing changes to TA deployment in a school, I would perhaps have something around, which is what the evidence would suggest, that we should be thinking about TAs are deployed in a way that supplements but doesn't replace the teacher. You could set that as a kind of core principle. You could then perhaps describe it in terms of what that looks like in terms of kind of practices. So teachers working with all attaining pupils, not just with more higher attaining pupils, etc. So you're trying to kind of pin down some kind of anchors, if you like, in terms of the intervention that you're talking about. So that's the kind of the what. You then start thinking about, well, if we know what we're trying to do, how do we go about implementing it? And there's a very long table in this guidance report, which is a shorter version of an even longer table with even more activities in it. And I wanted to purposely capture a really broad range of implementation activities. I think there were 75 on the original kind of paper. And the reason for doing that is that we have a tendency in education, the default strategy is to train people. Sometimes it's called kind of train and pray. So we just kind of think, right, implementation is basically just training people. But there's a lot of things on here that are different kind of levers and strategies that you can do that supplements and builds around that training. Some of them might be around creating the motivation for that training to traction. So identifying champions, piloting sort of small scale changes and using those to kind of take other people with you, etc., etc. So, once you've thought about what you want to do, try and think a bit more systematically and about the right types of strategies used in the right kind of way at the right time. And perhaps things that work at different levels of the organisation. So strategies that might be around leadership or governance, as well as hands-on stuff in the classroom. And you're trying to get those things to align. And perhaps before you're thinking about, we're just going to do training on this, think, are there things that we can do, before or after or alongside that training? That given, it's probably a good chance that if you are implementing something, you will be doing some kind of training and professional development. And again, we've just written a bit of supplementary guidance that pulls together work on professional development. And I guess the take-home messages here would be that training, and by training I mean getting people in a room and doing things like this, can build up skills, knowledge and understanding. But broadly speaking, it's only when that's backed up in terms of follow-on support, typically as people are having a go at giving it a go, that you apply that knowledge that you've got from training into your kind of practice and doing it. So the analogy I keep using for this is, if you're learning to drive, sure, you might, get told how to learn a drive, you might be, given some training on how to learn to drive, but it's only when you've had a go, stalled 20 times, kind of deliberately practiced with some kind of coaching, with some ongoing support, that you translate your perhaps knowledge of how to drive into your ability to how to drive. So that's where the evidence is quite strong about the need for good quality follow-on support. And also, if you're thinking about professional development, try and think carefully about the duration of it, but also when the various activities kind of occur. Don't overwater the plants. Don't pack everything into like the first, the kind of term, if it's going to take time to revisit these over a longer kind of period. So, as I say, there's more in the guidance that unpacks around professional development. Okay, let's say you've done that. You've got a kind of clear plan. You know what you want to do. I think now then is the time where you really start thinking: are we in a position to deliver that plan? And there's a nice guy called Skashia breaks implementation readiness by thinking: do we have the motivation? Are we in a position to do this? Staff up for it? Do we have the general capacity, the leadership environment, the resources, the kind of the staffing? And then do we have a capacity relating to the innovation? Do we have the skills, the expertise, the equipment, the whatever that's specifically relating to that innovation? And you can think a bit more in a structured way about, are we in a position to do that? If you are doing that, great, kind of crack on. If not, you might want to revisit your plan and think, well, what do we need to do to get ourselves into a position where we're ready? If you've done that, then you can start thinking, right, well, how do we practically prepare for implementation? And a lot of this is the stuff that we'll be familiar about building the structures, the governance, the admin, the kind of all the stuff that's notable when it's not there, when it doesn't work. This is also when you start thinking about training people and doing upfront training and kind of developing the skills and expertise. But it's this I think is perhaps the thing that's sometimes overlooked, is that preparation is getting a really clear shared understanding of actually what we're trying to do. And I think what often happens is that the person that's been developing the idea has a really clear understanding because they've been really thinking about it, but we sometimes overlook the kind of time and effort it takes to get that shared understanding of what the intervention is and why we're doing it and how we're going to do it. And again, this is where these active ingredients can come in really kind of key, because if you've captured the real core elements of what you're trying to do, the real core kind of components, then it becomes much easier to communicate what they're going to be. Okay, so that's there's quite a lot there around preparation and kind of getting things ready. Deliver, this kind of stage around deliver, I think for me is around kind of rapid, continuous kind of improvement. And going back to the gardening analogy, the plant's there, but it's a small kind of seedling. It's in the ground, but you've got to nurture it, you've got to water it, you've got to kind of, and if you do that, you expect it to grow, and you expect it to grow kind of quickly. So really what we're trying to do here is identify and solve problems quickly as they're occurring, because they will. It will, of course, things will occur, but it's about picking those up and finding them quickly, and perhaps identifying successes to help solve those problems. So find out where it's working well, because it will be working better somewhere, and how can you use those to address some of the challenges that you're facing. It's about leading from the front, about kind of modelling what's going on, and following up training with coaching and support and kind of ongoing mentoring to embed some of the things that they've learned in training. But I think that idea of kind of continuous rapid improvement. Okay, so yeah, we've talked about this around, you learn to drive, you don't expect, in fact, you expect to be utterly terrible when you jump in a car for the first time, but you're going to get better by deliberate practice, support from a kind of, from a skilled instructor, and you're going to adapt and learn quickly as you kind of move into this. And I quite like this phrase: anything worth doing well is worth doing poorly. And it's typical that most of the good things do take a bit of effort to get moving, but we often stick at them because we know that the end point is going to be worth it while down the line. So for me, that sets up why we have to monitor kind of implementation. And I needed some convincing about asking schools to do yet more monitoring of things they're doing. But when you think about kind of implementation, delivery in those terms, oversimplified, but you're going to be pretty poor at the start, but you're going to be great when you finish. The only way, really, in which you can go between those 2 points is monitoring what's going on. Like, if you're not monitoring, you can't identify the successes and weaknesses. If you're not monitoring, you can't see whether or not your active ingredients, your kind of core practices are actually emerging in behaviours. If you're not monitoring, you might be finding that people are doing it, but they might hate it. It might not be feasible. It might not be getting to the right pupils. It might be costing a fortune. So monitoring implementation to me becomes the mechanism by which you move from kind of an early starting point to being really, really kind of good at it. And again, there's stuff in the guidance around how you go about monitoring implementation in an efficient way as possible.
Jonathan, just
Sure.
one thing to say about monitoring. I think it shows as a leader that you value it.
Yes.
If you introduce something and then walk away and never talk about it or look at it and interact with staff, it devalues the thing that you're trying to implement.
Yeah, absolutely. And and again, that having a kind of team of people that are overseeing this and can play a role in this, there's a lot of tasks to be done as well as kind of monitoring. And the other aspect of this is how that information is then being used and being communicated back to the school, and you kind of you're setting really clear in a clear way how we're essentially learning as an organisation to do these things. It's just it just would be crazy that you're just going to press go and it's suddenly all going to happen perfectly. So how we do that, we've got to do it by capturing the data on how it's being implemented. It'll come back. Okay, so the final bit of the report talks about sustain. I always end up rushing this bit because it's the end, but and I guess really what I would suggest is if you've got it and something working, again starting from the bottom, sometimes there's a risk that it gets moving and then we kind of walk off and start focusing on something else. So you need to think carefully about how we continuously kind of nurture and acknowledge and support the things that we've got working. So, using the gardening analogy, if you might have something that's grown, but you walk away and it comes back and it's all gone wild and all gone kind of slightly kind of, you have to prune it, you have to tend to it, you have to kind of keep track of it. So there's some content there around how we think about how we continuously acknowledge and support the things we've got working. But if you've got it working at a small scale, you might think, well, how do we take this wider? How do we get this working across the organisation? And I would suggest, if you're thinking about doing that, treat that as a new implementation process in itself, because the way in which you might have got it working within one department might be different than the way in which you're going to roll it out in a different way. You might have to use some of the people that you've got it working with to model it to others. There's going to need a different range of strategies. I mean, hopefully you've got a real foundation, but try and think about scaling up again in a kind of planned, thoughtful kind of way. So just to kind of summarise, kind of covered a huge amount there. I think some take-homes of this. I think we need to start thinking about implementation as a process with a kind of rhythm, doing the right things at the kind of right time. We do need time. We can't keep kind of trying to kind of do this in a rush kind of way, and particularly the importance of preparation and giving time to get everything ready, I think reaps dividends in terms of when you get things working. Think about how you can have a plan, a clear, logical, well-specified plan. And then within that plan, having some idea of where do you need to be tight, what are the kind of things that you need to hold kind of consistent to, and what are the things you can really get tight fidelity, and where is the scope for adaptation, where is it in kind of the scope for staff to wrap around all sorts of additional aspects of their practice. Thinking about a range of implementation strategies. Not just reverting to training, thinking about how you can build on that training with follow-on support. And then when you're moving into delivery, almost expecting things to be like most aspects of adult learning. Expect things to be difficult, but that through high quality monitoring, high quality support, we're going to really rapidly grow and develop this as we start to put it into practice. And almost the earlier you can think about sustainability, the better. Thank you very much. Thank you. These are my details. Drop me a line if you want any more of that. As I say, a lot of all these resources are on the Education Endowment Foundation website, and we're just pulling together a pack of case studies, templates, planning resources, some additional summaries on professional development, so a whole range of kind of additional things that various kind of schools have been working with and we've developed. So thank you.